Hi, I'm Evie. I do mini video essays analyzing society. Today you are joining me for a comparison between today's AI revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So let's look at what actually tangibly matters for us, like if we can see the suffering of people caused by job loss from automation back then. Hindsight is 1780, so it is very easy to say that just because we are okay for now, that people back then must have also been doing just fine. We don't know how to imagine proper suffering, not anymore, neither can I, but I know that, and we all should be humble about that potentiality. The self-appointed fortune tellers who apparently have access to the deep thought computer at Goldman Sachs in their report from April 5th, 2023 said that by 2030 about 300 million people will lose their jobs due to AI. Historically, however, according to them, job losses have been offset by the creation of new jobs. Well, actually, even if history was like that, which you cannot just simplify just like that, still that does not mean that things would continue along the same trajectory. Of course, they can't predict chaos and destitution. You gotta keep calm for the investors. And the worst part is, it mostly works. If an entity of authority predicted the apocalypse, it could actually trigger the apocalypse. Our reality is created in the context of other people. We are dumb. But it is a faulty notion that we tend to innovate ourselves out of suffering. From the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution to some semi-tangible reforms, it took at best 60 years. Sure, eventually we will all die, the sun will engulf the earth, and the universe will be at peace. But we are not that materialistic and nihilistic when it comes to our lives, nor should we be. So take the report with a grain of salt the size of the Sisyphus boulder. Jobs are not a stable unit in a society, and if there is no wage labor and growing demand, capitalism is in trouble. Is it going to be worse than that? Probably, if no regulation happens in time, yes. But the chance that some sorority boys with daddy's money who never visited a grocery store in their lives researched the future into existence is absurd. But what will people do then? I'm just going to say it outright because I have no idea where else to place this thought. People are not smart. We are just not. For the most part, we are icky monkeys. So really, realistically, I cannot imagine what kinds of non-menial, non-repetitive jobs will emerge that people will end up doing further down the line. Jobs that also would be impossible to automate with AI? I don't see anything. So either the world will be reduced to a couple hundred geniuses who will joke around and maybe explore the universe, or God help us, I guess. So what was it like before, during the Industrial Revolution? Was it at all similar, and is the comparison even merited? Since the Industrial Revolution was happening very unevenly across Europe, we will only look at a few illustrative examples of what was actually happening in society. And since England was the first one to industrialize and there is a lot of information about what was going on, we will focus on England for now. Nothing personal. The first of what could be called a factory by today's standards was Arkwright's cotton mill at Cromford, Derbyshire. I don't know.
Derbyshire.
It was a water-powered mill that was established in 1771. The workers they were employing had housing and schools. They employed men, women, and, well, children. But I don't really mean children of the workers, no. I mean the children from the child labor stories. So where did they come from? Isn't that the more interesting question? Usually you only hear about how child labor ended, but how did it start? Abandoned children are unfortunate even today, and in medieval times they were super screwed slaves of convenience. In England, there was this conviction that people held basically since the 16th century that poor people and abandoned children should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Yes. And in 1601, the Elizabethan poor laws were established. You can imagine it as state-sanctioned indentured servitude. There was an entire infrastructure dedicated to quote-unquote helping the poor, which in practice meant that in a specific area, a supervisor was appointed to look after the poor and also the poor children. They would contract these children out to local or sometimes far-out factories, usually until these children were about 21, with some crumbs of basic education. By the way historians establish literacy about that time is looking at whether the person is able to sign their name on a piece of paper, and still the literacy rate back then was about 50%, so you can imagine the level of education. These children had no say in where they would end up and usually worked in horrifying conditions. Yes, the state technically took care of the poor, but in such a way that in some heavily industrialized areas, the life expectancy could have been about 25 years old easily. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly what would happen if suddenly nobody could work and there was this moral notion that people need to work to deserve to be alive. I'm just saying there is the precedent for it. The more I look at history, the more I just see Renaissance and suffering, suffering, and toothbrushes. And if a family could not take care of their kid or just needed another human to work, then why not employ the youngest child that happened to survive until the ripe old age of 7? Children were about 80% cheaper than a man and about 50% cheaper than a woman. It was not until the 1830s that some actual meaningful regulation was being passed, and basically not until the late 1880s that children were somewhat protected from the abuse. I don't mean to glaze Britain too much, but this is the British we're talking about. They're basically a different species when it comes to enforcing human rights for themselves, and yet still, it took them about 60 years, so 2 to 3 generations before any meaningful protections were passed. What chance does the rest of the world have today? But the British abolished slavery! Oh yeah, well it took them the longest to abolish it amongst themselves. While there unfortunately aren't specific numbers of how many people lost their jobs, it is partially reflected in how many people left their own countries, particularly for the United States, because that's where the promise of work still was. I won't list many, let's just look at a few examples so you get an idea. Take this as general estimates over the decades, and not everyone left because their job was gone, but it all illustrates the scale of societal changes that were taking place. About 5 million people left Germany just for the United States during the 19th century. The records are sparse for other destinations, but you can imagine it was probably not small. Scandinavia lost about 3 million people to migration to the United States. Their population in the 19th century combined was about 8 million. About 13 million people left Italy. From that, about 4 million just for the United States between the years 1876 to 1915. Italy unified in 1861, and in the first census that same year, there were about 22.4 million people living in Italy. 13 million left in the following 50 years. To call that massive would be an understatement. Where would you go now if there is no more work? Nowhere, that's where. The faces of the Industrial Revolution are mute. We can see them, but they are distant, as if stronger, more resilient, and also barely like us, or so we like to think. Today everyone is the main character, and would a main character accept decades of living like Oliver Twist if it meant at 500 years into the future, the offspring of the humans that will still have kids will live somewhat better off, but that's what we are in for, at best. So, is anyone safe? I listened to this advice video yesterday because I wanted suffering, and I have to react to the core of the message, the only real quote-unquote advice this person gave. So let's listen.
4. The jobs that use AI directly, and even more importantly, the entrepreneurial opportunities that move higher up the stack to deliver proprietary solutions via AI.
He's basically saying that to have one of the last jobs to survive, you have to be the one to provide AI services. Well, not really. Even if some baseline demand was maintained with UBI, that would still choke growth so much that just imagine it like a permanent Great Depression. Line goes up is stability. Line is steady means death. And when people figure out that even the lottery-like probability of social mobility is gone, good luck to all of us with that level of social unrest. There has to be wage labor to drive up demand. Or we will be treated like the children of early modern England, rented out to wealthy barons for years for meager wages, because maintaining oneself with slave labor will be the moral thing to do. Despite all of this potential dystopia, I do believe that humanity will get over it eventually. Now, if it is in 100 years or 300 years is another question. And at that point, it might as well not matter. We have reached the end of the video, I mean. If all goes well, there will be more tomorrow. Treat yourself kindly, try doing one good deed to keep the world running, and subscribe if this video felt interesting to you.